Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending where you are. Welcome to this session on COVID-19 emergencies and transitions. This session is grappling with obviously a crucial issue. COVID-19 has been something which has affected literally every person on Earth. And one of the interesting things about it, of course, the mysteries, is that it affects different people differently. We have determined, of course, that certain people, certain individuals have comorbidities which make them more susceptible to effects of the virus. And I like to analogize this to governmental systems. Not only has COVID affected every individual, but it's affected hundreds and hundreds of individual governance systems, some of which also have comorbidities. And it's interesting now, as the pandemic is not subsiding, but entering a stage where at least some countries are coming out of it, that it would be that we can go back and look and see how these things have affected particular countries. Obviously, countries which have had conflict or post-conflict settings are likely to be particularly vulnerable. And this was the topic of a seminar that was held at the University of Edinburgh in December and produced a report, which you will see a link to in the chat eventually. It's co-sponsored by International IDEA, the University of Edinburgh Centre for Constitutional Law, and the Program on Political Settlements there at Edinburgh. And many of us were there. We are going to hear some of the highlights of that report this morning, as well as have a broader discussion on the ways in which the COVID-19 emergency has been particularly challenging or difficult, or the effects it's had on democracy processes, on political transitions, on conflict arrangements, on the implementation of peace agreements, etc. So we have a wonderful panel this morning to help guide us through this. In order of presentation, we're going to first hear from Dr. Sean Malloy, who is the principal author of the report I just mentioned. He's the lecturer at Northumbria School of Law and an affiliate of the Political Settlements Research Program at Edinburgh. He's published widely in human rights law, constitutional law, and transitional justice. And we're going to begin with his presentation of some of the highlights. Then we're going to have a conversation with our three distinguished commentators. First, Professor Fionnuala Ní Aoláin, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism, who's also the Regents Professor at the University of Minnesota Law School and a very distinguished scholar of emergencies, human rights, gender, conflict resolution, and terrorism. So she has a lot of important angles for this particular topic. We'll next hear from Dr. Adam Ababa, who is currently a program officer with the Constitution Building Program for International IDEA based in The Hague, Netherlands. He's worked all over the world, and particularly focusing on Africa, looking at conflict resolution processes and the role of constitutions therein. He's also a widely published scholar who's on the board of the International Journal of Constitutional Law. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Dr. Sonia Bohito, who's a longstanding human rights activist and practitioner who has worked with international non-governmental organizations all over the world. She's focused particularly on Africa and on human and children's rights, has a PhD from Pretoria, South Africa, in comparative constitutional law. So we're very excited and honored to have this distinguished group. The format will be, just after Dr. Malloy's initial presentation, a conversation among the rest of us, and then we will open it up for questions. So if you do have questions, I invite you to put them in chat or eventually think about raising your hand, and we will certainly be able to include you. Without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Malloy.
Thanks very much, Tom. So as was mentioned, this report was developed as a follow-up to the 7th Edinburgh Dialogue on Post-Conflict Constitution Building, which was held in December 2020. Now, we know that governments in many countries have triggered emergency legal frameworks to disable some ordinary democratic procedures and set aside standard political and legal accountability mechanisms as part of their response to COVID-19. And while the impacts of both the pandemic and responses to it have been felt globally, they often have quite different consequences in countries attempting peace and democratic transition processes. And so we were particularly interested in societies undergoing twin transitions, which are loosely defined as societies in which intertwined yet distinct transitions from authoritarianism to democracy and from conflict to peace are being attempted simultaneously. And what we find is that COVID-19 responses have indicated different ways of institutionalizing an emergency response. So firstly, some states have declared a constitutional state of emergency. So constitutions will often, but not always, enable a state to trigger a legal state of emergency. So they'll define the conditions for its declaration, so when it can be declared, a delegation of power, so who's to enjoy wider powers. It'll place limitations on the use of these powers and also then have provisions for legislative and judicial oversight. And we see such contexts as Colombia, Mali, and the Democratic Republic of Congo have used the constitutional state of emergency in response to COVID. The second broad approach, a broad way to address the contagion has been to use legislation. So some states have relied on ordinary legislation to provide the legal foundation for emergency measures, either alone or in combination with a constitutional state of emergency. And in particular, many countries have relied on public health laws to enable sweeping powers for detention, quarantine, and even lockdown. And so some examples of countries that have used this approach has been Kenya, South Africa, Nepal, and Myanmar. And the third broad approach then has been what we term ambiguous groundings. So these are the countries that have assumed and exercised emergency powers without a clear legislative or constitutional foundation. So there's nowhere that we can automatically point to and say this is where the authority for these wider powers come from. And examples include Sri Lanka, Rwanda, and Somalia, and the Central African Republic. Now, in terms of why different countries adopt different approaches, I don't think there's any one particular reason. So in some cases, it'll be due to the legal framework in place. So for instance, some constitutions do not allow for a state of emergency. In other contexts, they have had particularly bad experiences under a state of emergency, and so may well have relied on ordinary legislation. In other settings still, it could be a result of political calculations. So we have seen, for example, leaders wanting to downplay the pandemic. But in theory, through a constitutional state of emergency or using legislation, the state remains within the rule of law. So there's limits on power, accountability, and ultimately the rule of law is preserved. By contrast, when there's no legal basis, this raises questions as to the legality of emergency measures. And there's a danger that without a pre-established legal framework, government's power will be unconstrained and unregulated. But in reality, what we've found, and this I think reflects other studies into emergency powers more generally, is that the legal form appears to matter less. Rather, what is important is firstly how powers are used, if and how powers are constrained, and thirdly, the wider context within which emergency powers are used and the dynamics that are at play. And this third one is particularly important, I think, in conflict-affected settings. So in terms of how powers are used, well, we have seen some examples of leaders trying to entrench their power through a further process of democratic deconsolidation. So, for example, using emergency powers to pass suspect legislation, for instance, anti-terrorism legislation. We see an uber securitization or militarization of the state. So many countries have increased the role of the military in their response to COVID-19. And we also see leaders using the pandemic to target dissenters, so deliberately restricting freedom of movement, freedom of expression, assembly, and particularly against those who seek to challenge their power. And we see responses like this, I think, in places like the Philippines, Cambodia, and Sri Lanka. And so with this abuse and use of power, then what becomes particularly important is the institutional safeguards in place. And globally, I think we've seen a number of positive examples of courts stepping in to limit this power. So for example, in Brazil, Malawi, Bosnia, and the Central African Republic. But in other cases, courts and legislators who should curb the executive power have appeared unwilling or unable to do so. So in Sri Lanka, for example, the president flatly refused to recall parliament, which had been dissolved ahead of elections, despite a constitutional requirement to do so in circumstances like the pandemic. And subsequently, the Sri Lankan Supreme Court refused to allow legal proceedings in order to challenge this. We also see that legislators, for example, have been unable to curb executive action because they simply couldn't meet as a result of the pandemic. And it's also important to note that in societies undergoing transitions, the institutions themselves are in the process of being rebuilt. And what this can lead to in these contexts where institutions are not able to curb executive power is that these powers can become normalized. And this is always one of the real risks in terms of emergency powers, that the exception subsequently becomes the norm. So the first thing then is how powers are used, and secondly, whether or not these powers are in fact curtailed through institutional mechanisms. And thirdly is the issue of the wider context within which emergency powers are used. So for example, if we think about Myanmar, some would suggest that the NLD response to the pandemic was particularly successful in terms of trying to draw in different groups, ethnic minority groups, for example. But one of the repercussions of this arguably is that the dynamics changed and support was drawn away from the military, which arguably led to the coup. Similarly, when we think about multi-layered governance, so in many conflict-affected settings, there are constitutional and political arrangements which divide power between different layers. And in some cases, the pandemic has hindered progress. For example, in Somalia, political processes have slowed as a result of the pandemic, preventing the move towards federalism. And also in terms of the relationship between the state and sub-state units, if we think about places like Nepal, for example, the legal framework that has been relied upon predated the move towards federalism. So this creates all sorts of difficulties in terms of coordination between the state and sub-state units. And also there have been issues around lack of resources at the sub-state entities. Another factor and another area, I suppose, which arises from the broader context is elections. So in transitioning societies, we know elections are instrumental in conferring legitimacy on a government and are frequently viewed as the end goal of any negotiated transition and a key step towards democratization. But when elections are postponed, this can be interpreted as a deliberate move on the part of the government to entrench power by further preventing democratic transitions. And there are also problems which emerge in terms of, if elections can't be held, well then what does the society do? For example, should those in power remain in power, or what should ensue? And this has created a lot of uncertainty in places like the Central African Republic and Ethiopia, where it's not at all clear. So looking at all these different factors, then we made a number of suggestions as to how we might respond going forward. And they are indeed suggestions rather than recommendations to account for the incomplete picture that we have regarding COVID and responses to it. So firstly, the pandemic has exposed limits and gaps in existing legal frameworks. In some cases, epidemics are not covered in constitutional provisions on emergency response, which limits decision makers' options. In other cases, outdated legislation has been exploited to engage in an emergency response that benefits the incumbent powers. So here there's an opportunity to update these legal groundings and to try and harmonise legal frameworks. Secondly, the pandemic has exposed difficulties in some situations of multi-layered governance, particularly where arrangements are complex and identity-driven. And this provides an opportunity to address these weaknesses. So for example, efforts could focus on redrafting laws or clarifying constitutional arrangements on issues of overlapping jurisdiction and distribution of power. Thirdly, in such contexts as South Sudan and Somalia, but also Nepal, the pandemic could galvanize the process of moving towards a negotiated, decentralized system of governance. As countries such as the Philippines and Sri Lanka undermine transition towards democracy, opposition may continue to grow, pushing for further reform and change. Fourthly, in conflict-affected situations, particularly those in which increased autonomy for identity-based groups is integral to a negotiated transition, the pandemic has reshaped incentives and the relative positions of state and non-state parties to the process. So parties to negotiation can therefore learn from the mutual and distinct challenges associated with the pandemic response when seeking to forge peace agreements. And finally, the pandemic has brought into stark relief continued existence of fault lines that, despite progress in building peace or democracy, remain and retain the capacity to resurface as contentious partisan conflict drivers. So in recognizing the potential for these fault lines to undermine transitions, renewed efforts can focus on building institutional mechanisms for reconciliation and cooperation between groups, and on entrenching as appropriate constitutional and other safeguards to mitigate the risk that dominant parties will unilaterally and opportunistically undermine long-standing political settlements. Thanks, Tom.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Sean, for that very concise overview of a lot of different material, a lot of different cases. And in particular, I was struck by your last point about the fault lines. You know, one of the things we've seen even in non-conflict settings is that existing inequalities have been exacerbated in virtually every case. And so obviously, mutatis mutandis, one would think that would be a much more severe problem, the strategic behavior being induced in conflict settings. So I'd like to turn first to Fionnuala and ask you how these concerns sort of square with your prior understanding as a scholar, but also your work as special rapporteur.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Sean and to the Political Settlements Programme for both the work, but also the opportunity to have this policy engagement around it. So I would say a couple of things, at least from the perspective of the mandate I hold. Many of the observations in the report hold true and are very cogent. We're seeing, I think, four distinct patterns emerge. One is an expansion of the use of formal executive powers by centralized authorities, and that has been widespread across the globe and I think consistent. The second is an increased use of what we might call, or at least in my own scholarly work, we've called undeclared or informal emergencies or de facto emergencies. And those again are proliferating across the globe. The third thing I would say is that we are also seeing the third box, which really overlaps with the work of the mandate I hold, is the increased leaning into security and counterterrorism powers by a number of states to manage a health pandemic. And to concur, that raises the obvious problem that when the pandemic's effects fall disproportionately or discriminatorily on certain already marginalized community, there's a real challenge when the coercive power of the state is being used to regulate the health experience and challenges of those communities in multiple settings. I think what I'd also flag in that box is that one of the effects that we're seeing is the legitimation of security and coercive power or counterterrorism power in national settings, where the security sector is, I want to say, making itself indispensable to the state in a way that consolidates and affirms patterns of negative behavior and lack of accountability for the security sector. The fourth and final observation I would make is that all of these, I think, boxes that Sean and the report identify, of course, are now operating in silos. In many countries, they're operating in the same space, so that you have both formal, whether it's constitutional or legislative power being exercised, but also in tandem with that, lots of informality around the exercise of exceptional powers. So I think we have to see all of these things as overlapping. And the second thing I would say is that much of the emergency power work that's being done, at least from the mandate's perspective, and is being done not at the central level, is being done at city, municipality, regional, state, depending on the structure, governance. So we're seeing the exercise of exceptional or emergency powers by a range of actors that we've traditionally not looked at to understand how emergencies play out. And all of this, I think, is problematic in general as we see the expansion of this space, but actually particularly problematic for transitional or fragile states, where part of the motif of transition is often a move away from the excess and coercive power of the state, which has been exercised to negative effect and being one of the causes conducive to conflict. So the fact that the pandemic reinstills, reasserts, re-enables, and supports the security state, which often comes back and reasserts itself in transitional processes or comes back after the transition is over to undermine transition because its power is enormously affected, I think is enormous cause for concern about the long-term effects of this period of time on societies that are either undergoing transition or have come out of or are seen as transitioned, but have now had a set of old, if you want, the DNA of security, securitization, exceptionality reignited through the pandemic. And I think a good example of that is the events that we've seen in El Salvador in recent days really underscore that patterning in a way that I think I would expect to see more of. So I'll stop there.
Terrific. Thank you so much for those remarks. I'd like to turn next to Adam. One of the countries, of course, that we observe in conflict and struggling, and the country you've worked in, is Ethiopia. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how these particular concerns have played out there.
Thank you, Tom. So basically, Ethiopia was transitioning. There were a lot of popular protests that forced some kind of transition within the ruling party itself that brought new leadership in 2018. And the country was in transition when the COVID pandemic was detected in the country. Now, before I go into the details, I think what characterized Ethiopia at that particular moment, and broadly countries in transition, is the pervasive mistrust. There's a lot of mistrust among actors, and there's also several divisions, a lot of disagreement on a number of fundamental issues, and the stakes are very high. And in this context, at the same time, there is very little habit or tradition of peacefully resolving disputes, right? So when COVID happens, one, it creates new issues, additional issues on top of the other problems the country faces, and it also happens in a context where a resolution of conflicts, there's no culture of resolution of conflicts. And that's exactly what happened in Ethiopia. So as soon as in April 2018, the change led to the coming to power of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and he got a lot of goodwill, but not trust yet. So he had built a lot of goodwill, and even that goodwill was facing challenge in early 2020. And when the COVID-19 emerged, there were already talk of what's going to happen, particularly in relation to the elections, which were planned to be held in August 2020. And these were not just ordinary elections. Ethiopia has had several elections, but there was massive expectation that these will be, at least in relative terms, extremely contested and more free and fair. So there was a lot of expectation over the elections. Naturally, just like all governments, the Ethiopian government at the federal level, but also at the state level, started taking measures, and that forced the electoral commission, the electoral board, to recalculate, to consider whether it could manage to deliver elections within a short period of time under new limitations. So that the electoral board was already under extreme pressure, time pressure. So there was a lot of questions on whether they would actually deliver the elections. And in fact, normally elections are held in May, but it's because of the constraints that they pushed it to August. So everybody knew that the board was going to struggle, even under the best of circumstances. So when COVID happened, it was clear that the elections would not happen. And of course, that's already exacerbated the problems, the lack of mistrust the country was facing. And initially, this was more a technical question, whether the constitution allows the postponement of elections and under what conditions, and how would the government will be formed. But because of the lack of the pervasive mistrust, and because of the lack of culture of resolving constitutional issues in a peaceful manner, this was already discarded as unacceptable. So the outcome was seen as predictable in a manner that will benefit the ruling party. So what it did basically was that it was already a strained transition, and it worsened it. So the additional contestation, particularly about the elections, created more problems. In particular, the party, the political group that was dominant before the transition, and that had to give way into the new powers, was not happy. And they challenged the decision to postpone the elections and the process through which this was decided, and ultimately pushed for elections themselves, which obviously intensified the contestation, and ultimately, as some of you may know, the war that started in November 2020. So overall, I think, considering the context within which the the COVID-19 emerged, it was already, to use Tom's analogy, it was a recovering patient. And unfortunately, COVID was too heavy for the country to make it. And what we see at the moment is that now the government's trying to hold elections again in June. But obviously, the trust has broken. Some of the opposition forces are boycotting the elections. So we see that obviously we're still under COVID, but we see that the impact that it has had on the politics continues. And the country is a lot more fragile today than in March 2020 when the first COVID case was detected. So it has weakened the prospects for transition to peace and much less to democracy.
Terrific. Thank you, Adam, for that depressing report. And now I'd like to turn to Sonia. I know one of the countries you've worked on is Central African Republic, which is also undergoing transition. So how have the COVID or emergency dynamics affected that context and process?
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the Central African Republic. In fact, the Central African Republic wasn't going through transition when the COVID crisis started. The transition was over, came to an end in 2015. And then when democratic elections were held in 2016. So the Central African Republic is not a country going through transition, but it's a country affected by a conflict, long-standing conflict. When the first case of COVID-19 was recorded, the government actually was holding only about 20 or 25%, was actually controlling only 20 or 25% of the territory. All the rest of the country was in the hands of was controlled by armed forces, by rebels. So they were in a dilemma because it was difficult to implement any emergency measures. They did adopt emergency measures, not by law. National Assembly did not enact any specific emergency law, not through the Constitution, because the president actually did not use declared a state of emergency, even though the Constitution has provision for it. It did not use, there was also in the Constitution the possibility of using exceptional powers for exceptional circumstances. The president chose not to use it, but he set up a task force, which he was leading, and then he carried out like a campaign in the media, etc. So emergency measures were taken, but obviously they were not implemented across the country, since in any case, the government did not have any control over most of the country. So it was a bit difficult for the government to implement those measures, but they closed the borders, they took all other measures, closing schools, etc. But then by March, April 2020, also, they knew that they had to organize elections. In December 2020, the presidential elections were supposed to be held, and they knew that it was going to be difficult to hold the elections. It was clear that, for example, the election body, the agency for organizing the election, couldn't go out, couldn't send out its agents across the country to finalize the electoral roll. It was clear that it wasn't going to happen. So the government decided, not the government obviously, but the majority party decided to amend the constitution, to suggest a bill to amend the constitution. And then when, with the support of the government, of course, civil society, opposition parties were shocked because the constitution was not used to protect the population against the pandemic, but suddenly they wanted to amend it to postpone the election. The idea of the bill was to amend the constitution so that the president could stay in power. The president and the MPs could stay in power for a certain time, which would be defined by the Constitutional Court until the pandemic will be sorted, and then they would organize the election. This went to the Constitutional Court, which of course ruled against the amendment of the Constitution. The Constitutional Court found that it wasn't, that the duration of the presidential term was protected by what it called a constitutional lock. So it wasn't possible to amend the Constitution for the president to stay just because of the COVID crisis. So we found out that actually the COVID crisis exposed the government's fragility in terms of the democratic process and dealing even with emergency situation. And in retrospect, maybe even COVID crisis was used by the authorities to stay in power, to buy time, because they were not controlling the country anyway. Even if they wanted to organize the elections, how would they have done it? It wasn't because of COVID, but because they had no control over the country. They needed to negotiate with warlords, regions by region, to allow for them to be allowed to send electoral agents to then finalize the electoral roll. So it wasn't really COVID as such. It was more about the conflict situation in the country. So COVID was used, actually. That's now the analysis. It was an opportunity to stay, but then it was rejected. The plan actually fell because of the Constitutional Court, and they decided to go ahead with the election. The election took place. It was difficult, but it took place. Luckily, they had the support of the international community, as well as including the MINUSCA, which is the UN forces in the Central African Republic. So they pushed for it. There was a search, and we realized also that the rebels and even the opposition party did not want the election to take place. But by then, the debate about COVID and so on had been set aside. We were no longer talking about COVID. It was more about elections, security, and so on. But MINUSCA decided that they were going to help and protect electoral agents and voters to ensure that the election would take place. And it did take place with a low voter turnout, but still it happened. It was validated by the Constitutional Court. And okay, as to conclude, just to say, as of now, today, and then it started even a couple of weeks ago, infection rate rose in COVID infection rate rose in the Central African Republic. There is a state of emergency, but not because of COVID, but because of the conflict situation, but no specific measures have been taken regarding COVID. So COVID really has never been a priority. It is more about security in the country, getting rid of the rebels. And today, the country now has control, they say 80% of the government control 80% of the territory. So in a year, things that from not controlling 80%, today they're controlling 80%. COVID is higher, but it's not a problem. They're dealing with it the way they can. And at least we know that we have a strong constitutional court which can protect the institution regardless of the situation, whether it is COVID or a conflict. So that's the situation in the Central African Republic now.
Thank you. It's a wonderful, wonderful story to end on, in a sense, because I'm sort of reminded of Adam's point that the effects of this crisis on governance are going to take a long time for us to fully understand, just as the effects of the disease. Maybe 30 years from now, we learn that everyone who had COVID lives longer, or maybe they die younger, that there may be long-term effects that we don't know about. I mean, Adam's story suggested long-term negative effects, but Sonia suggests actually, sort of from a separation of powers point of view, what the Constitutional Court did in the Central African Republic may have some long-term positive effects for the rule of law. I actually have a question before we open up, and I do want to again invite the audience to raise your hands or put a question in the Q&A. The question I wanted to ask got to do with this sort of immediate response? I mean, particularly in a place where you have a military and rebels fighting. It's kind of a two-part question, which anyone can answer if they have information. The first is, have rebel groups taken COVID seriously? Like, we know that rebel governance is a real issue, and in some cases, rebel governance is actually better than the government's governance, which is part of their efficacy. So I wonder if there are any examples where the rebels have actually tried to promote some kind of response at all. The second, and relatedly, in a lot of countries, the military is sort of the only functioning institution. So there's great temptation to use the military for all kinds of other tasks. And I wonder if any of you have seen anywhere where the military becomes the primary delivery service for, COVID response, the military playing a direct role, and if that has had any effect. So I'm just going to throw that out there and see if anyone would like to answer. Go ahead, Fianola.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have great data, actually, Tom. That's the bottom line answer. I think we don't have great data either on rebel governance so I think very little data. I think what I see in the counterterrorism space is a lot of assertions by governments that non-state actors have been using this time to plot nefarious things, which is a good reason to further empower and support governments to do their work and to give them the requisite international support for that. So that's the dynamic we're certainly seeing in the counterterrorism and security space, is very poor data, lots of assertions about the utilization of this time by non-state actor groups to further undermine governments, and the need to solidify and supports to governments. I'll defer on the military organization question. Maybe other panelists have better data than I do on that.
Adam or Sonia, do either of you like to respond?
So the question was if the rebels took the COVID crisis seriously. Really, it was never an issue. It didn't even come into the debate. Usually their demands is about the control of the country, them not being treated well, their well-being. I think COVID is more about thinking about the population and so on. This certainly wasn't the agenda of the rebels, because obviously most of them are in a mining area, so they think more about mining and diamond and gold. COVID certainly wasn't an issue for them. I don't know if Adam wants to say something.
Yeah, no, so two things. So in the Ethiopian context, there were essentially no organized rebels as such. But as Shan indicated in the beginning, there was contestations between one of the government, the ruling party in one of the regions, and the central government. So in that sense, there was you can have a parallel, but there were no rebels. But there were rebels in Somalia. Al-Shabaab, as Fiona said, would have to study it more, and I would have to dig into it more. But they actually took it seriously, and they were very organized in terms of how they were responding to it. But the details are not very clear. But there are experiences of some rebel groups which control territory and which have an administrative structure of sorts in a way they respond to. In terms of the military, in Ethiopia, I think there was some deployment, particularly to enforce some of the rules, but it was not very serious. And in fact, one of the challenges is that there are rules in terms of mass and all of that, but there were no enforcement mechanisms for it. So there was no such a direct role for the military in relation to COVID-19.
Terrific. So we have a couple of questions. I'm going to take them in the order in which I've seen them. And I'm going to start with Will McDermott, who asks, have you seen any positive examples of accountability in COVID responses in the CAR, Ethiopia, or any other countries? Positive examples of accountability. And I may actually turn to Sean first, since he obviously has got the wide view about accountability.
I think there's some examples in places like Bosnia, for example, or in Brazil, where the courts have played quite an active role in terms of trying to curb executive action. And as Sonia said, certainly the Central African Republic, the courts seem to have played an important role in terms of limiting the potential force de jure that could have come into force. So I think Brazil and Bosnia would be the two that I would suggest looking at in terms of positive examples from the courts.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Fiona?
I mean, the one example I would say, and this is not at the is we've seen some positive city level examples. So the city, Colombia, I think in particular, the role of a number of mayors, Bogota being the most obvious one, where a really engaged stakeholder approach to including all affected communities in the decision-making processes, including in the deployment of security and other actors to enforce, has been really noticeable. And I think the mayor of Bogota has really talked about her process of engaging stakeholders in COVID response, and I think that's probably one of the better models we've seen. I think the other example I would use is it's a court example, which is the example of the Israeli Supreme Court on the decisions around the use of tracing apps. A really robust decision by the court pushing back at the attempts by the executive to expand the use of surveillance powers that had been developed in a CT security context to the health example. The challenge I think we face with all of these good court examples, and I think they're important to document, is the extent to which in some countries they have in fact then been applied by the executive. So I think the problem there is there's quite a degree of variance. Even where the courts have been robust, they're not always followed.
Adam, please.
Perhaps I think maybe Sonia can talk about it, but I think what happened in the constitutional courts of the Central African Republic is not really a question of accountability, because it was more prevention, right? With the courts there. So maybe she can speak a bit more about it.
In fact, I was going to talk about accountability, but in another way, in terms of implementing the emergency measures. It was an issue because there was no legal framework for all the measures taken, and we knew that there was financial and technical assistance from the international community, including WHO, UNDP, and so on. So there were concerns because they thought all the money may be given to the government. What were they doing with it, since they were not accountable for whatever was given to them? So people had suspicions about the number of the infection rate declared by the Ministry of Health. So maybe they were blowing the numbers to be able to get more money from the international community. So that's also another way of seeing things in terms of transparency and accountability. And yes, of course, for the Constitutional Court, it's about accountability. The state, the government being accountable to its people and to the Constitution, constitutionalism, in fact. And so the court stopped any willingness of trying to stay a bit longer. They had to be accountable and respect the terms of the Constitution. Yeah, over.
Terrific. I'd like to turn to Kimana Zulueta-Fulcher, who is the acting head of the Constitution Building Program at International IDEA.
Thanks, Tom. I actually wanted to respond to one of your previous questions about how rebel groups have or not taken COVID seriously. And I have an interesting example in Myanmar, right? At least before the coup. Myanmar, of course, a country where there are multiple ethnic armed organizations with different strengths, etc. But some of them have really not only territorial control, but also parallel administrations. And initially, the government actually set up a sort of a formal framework for coordination with some of these ethnic armed organizations to help it deal with COVID, with the COVID pandemic. This formal framework did not really work that very well. But what did work is informal linkages between the ethnic armed organizations, even the military, in some instances, not always, of course, and the government. And they were able to curb, partly at least, and protect the citizenry in those states at the borders of the country from COVID and from much worse consequences. So I think that's a really interesting thing that one could look into.
Yeah, it's an interesting finding in the general literature on rebel governance that we think of these forces being opposed, but there's also sometimes tacit cooperation in very interesting and complex ways. Professor Asanga Welikala of the University of Edinburgh.
Thanks, Tom. Just doctor, not professor. The two broad points. The first is, I think, certainly from a kind of South Asian perspective, one of the things about the pandemic, and Sean mentioned this, I think, in our paper, was that certainly in a place like Sri Lanka or India, a completely independent process of backsliding was already happening. In India, what Tarun Kaitan calls a kind of death by 1,000 cuts kind of process of a pretty well entrenched and democratized and institutionalized states being the erosion happening through all sorts of that was already happening when the pandemic came last year. In Sri Lanka, a little bit more dramatic because the swings in a smaller place like Sri Lanka are much bigger than a big oil tanker like India. But nonetheless, there are comparative things that we can, I think, look at in terms of the way that populist or populist style leaders who are already in situ, already in the process of doing things to constitutional democracy, then this came upon them as a kind of opportunity, and that was the big worry. I remember at the time that we were drafting this report, other work that we were doing last year, right? Like with, for example, from the lessons that we have learned from Fionnuala and Oren Gross's work, right? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that authoritarians love, because these are executive centric things. This is their moment. The one thing, though, and that's my second point, is first the first or second waves in 2020 of the public health challenge posed by the pandemic in South Asia wasn't as large as it was in, for example, Europe or Brazil or wherever. I mean, people died, and those are, every death is to be regretted, but in terms of scale, that was not what it was. What's happening is what's happening right now, which is the second or third wave, or however you count this stuff. It's not the 2020 problem, but it's the 2021 issue. India is just collapsing. And the issue then that arises is, these guys are there, Modi and Rajapaksa, saying, we need strong states, executives, we are decisive, we just do this stuff, we don't care about checks and balances, we don't care about democracy, because we have no problem deploying the military, doing all. And you're suddenly beginning to see a major problem of executive underreach rather than executive overreach. Where they don't seem to be able to know what the hell to do with this situation. And so it could be good news in the sense for a person like me who is very pro-democratization and not very pleased with Rajapaksa or Modi, that in the sense that, their electoral prospects might be very badly affected by this. On the other hand, you don't know, what underreach itself might do in the longer historical framework. Sorry for a very long kind of intervention, but thank you, Tom.
No, very helpful. This is a new phenomenon, new term that we've come up with, that Kim Lane Shepley and David Posen came up with, executive underreach. Usually you think of the problem in emergencies as the executive will grab all power, but we see, particularly with these populist leaders, non-response, and obviously Jair Bolsonaro maybe is the best example there. So that's something that's very interesting to understand. I would just mention Lukashenko in Belarus, who is an authoritarian who definitely underreached and then has suffered some kind of challenge to his rule. Aaron Houlihan of International Idea.
Thanks, Tom. I just wanted to, just building on something that Asanga was just mentioning in this context of broader democratic backsliding, and maybe particularly for Fionnuala, is the interaction between what we're seeing here in the sort of predictable opportunism and also issues with disinformation and misinformation, and how that has kind of kicked in, particularly with the development of populist leaders using this in an abusive way, and to normalize what's happening, to normalize the security state. This is necessary, and in so doing, you control information. And just if you're starting to see those particular links coming out, or if it's a little too early, and also, of course, in the other two case studies.
Would anyone like to respond?
I mean, just to say briefly, Tom, on the question about is disinformation and misinformation sort of conflating in this space? Absolutely. And I mean, the most practical example of that right now is we're in the middle of negotiating a global counterterrorism strategy in the middle of a pandemic. It's to be agreed in June. The negotiations started in earnest in January. And the states that you would anticipate who have been pushing securitizing measures and pushing COVID-19 language into that strategy are also the states seeking to control social media platforms, talking about a whole range, and also expanding the range of phenomena that they want to control, everything from misogyny to extreme right and extreme left-wing violence, depending on the state that you're dealing with. So I do actually think we're seeing attempts by states at the global level to actually to use global frameworks to actually further entrench the domestic practices of cracking down and disabling the free flow of information. Yes, absolutely.
Would any of our other panelists like to respond? Adam.
Well, so in the Ethiopian context, initially the main challenge in terms of misinformation and disinformation was in relation to ethnic hatred. But after a while, after COVID happened, it was also used. It actually provided a new opportunity for the government to crack down on some journalists in particular who are seen as undermining government authority. But overall, I think it has shown that the problems of misinformation and disinformation are critical. I think it has really emphasized the challenge that this poses. So perhaps there was a reluctance. It's a difficult balance between expression and freedom of expression and limits on it. And I think the fact that the pandemic happened, that there were a lot of misinformation and other things, it has created a new conversation, a new awareness about the challenge that the issue faces.
Terrific. Professor Christine Bell at the University of Edinburgh.
I was interested to ask Fionnuala in particular, what do you think the prognosis is for sort of ending states of emergency? Because in some senses, I suppose we're also living with the pandemic being with us. I notice in both in UK and Ireland, there's a lot more litigation happening around, specific instances of quarantine, whether particular justifications or small imprisonment, small fines are warranted. But, is it inevitable that we just end up with more ongoing restriction of liberty as a kind of normalized thing? And what does that sort of do to the idea of emergency being exceptional?
No, it's a really good question. And I think it's one. So I've been struck by, particularly in academic journals, there's been a whole slew of articles around derogations, as if sort of that's where the conversation with it would be. And it's not to undermine whether states should or should not be derogating. The reality is that in general, states are not as a practice, if we look at global practice right now. But even if they were, it seems to me that for international lawyers in particular concerned with rights protections in states of emergency, to view derogation as the bucket within which the oversight necessary for permanent emergency will be adequately addressed, I think is naive at best, given the history of oversight that we've seen and the strong deference, particularly, as you said, Christine, in the context where there's a recognized acknowledgement that there is we are living with some kind of exceptionality. I think we are seeing moves by some, so one is litigation strategies at national level. I think those are really important strategies. The second is to think about the need for some more, and there has been discussion about this, oversight at the global level, meaning from either the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly in a formalized way to actually to recognize this exceptionality and put in place, always inadequate, but at least some acknowledgement that some particularized form of oversight may be needed to identify the most egregious practice. And the third thing I think is to watch the space of COVID particularity seeping into regulatory frameworks across the globe. I think we're seeing that in SDG conversations. I think we're seeing it in Security Council resolutions. We're seeing it on a whole range of places. And I think there's whether it's academics, policymakers, or governments who are concerned about this, I think we have an inadequate grasp of the scale of the leaching that we're seeing from COVID into other regulatory frameworks. And that speaks to both the need for ongoing mapping, but also a set of solutions that recognize that our historic models of exceptionality premised on one-off sudden events that end may not be appropriate to a global pandemic, which may have an indefinite experience, and some other more meaningful forms of oversight are needed, which I don't think we've actually imagined yet in an adequate way.
It's a wonderful comment, and we're just about out of time, so I'll make a final remark, which is I think that Fionnuala's last comment is absolutely right. If you look, for example, at national constitutional emergency schemes, when they list the predicates for what can trigger a declaration of emergency, it tends to be war, invasion, natural disaster, perhaps. In the 21st century, COVID is maybe much more of the paradigm kind of emergency we're going to face. COVID, maybe financial crises, and those are not mentioned typically. And so I think Fionnuala is absolutely right that we have to reimagine what kind of governance schemes that we're going to need to address these challenges. The old framework of derogation and such is not really, as she noted, proven very important or central. And so that's going to require a lot of work from people like our panelists. So I'd like you all to join me in thanking everyone on the panel. It was a terrific discussion, and especially thanks to International IDEA and the Political Settlements Program for putting this work together, which we can draw on for years to come. Thank you very much.